November 11, 1887, Medicine Bow Range, Wyoming Territory. They thought he was crazy for using a tent. The first signs had come weeks earlier, carried on a wind that cut sharper than it should have for September. It slipped down from the peaks before dawn, crept across the valley floor, and found its way through every crack in every cabin. Men woke to frost on their blankets. Water buckets skinned over with ice overnight. Horses stood with their backs to the wind, heads low, breath rising in thick white clouds. Everyone understood the message. Winter was coming early, and when winter came early in the Medicine Bow Range, it never came gently. All across the valley, preparation began. Axes rang from dawn until dusk as firewood piles grew taller. Moss was packed into the seams between logs until fingers went numb. Clay was smeared and smoothed, crack by crack, to seal out the cold. Roofs were reinforced. Doors were rehung. Smoke curled constantly from chimneys as families tested stoves and hearths, making sure everything would work when it mattered. It was the same routine they followed every year. It had kept them alive before. It would have to do again, all except one man. The northern edge of the settlement, where the land sloped gently toward the timberline, Edmund Carver was doing something so strange that people rode out of their way just to see it with their own eyes. He wasn't chopping wood. He wasn't hauling stone. He wasn't even patching his chinking. He was wrapping his cabin in canvas. At first, neighbors assumed it was temporary. Maybe he was protecting the logs while he repaired something. Maybe he planned to take it down before the real cold arrived. But as the days passed, it became clear this wasn't a passing idea. He wrapped every wall. He wrapped the corners. He wrapped beneath the eaves and down past the foundation logs. He stretched the fabric tight, lashed it with rope, and anchored it to the ground like a man preparing for a storm at sea. People stopped and stared, some laughed outright. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few watched quietly, unsettled by the confidence with which Edmund worked, as if he knew something they didn't. Edmund Carver had arrived in the valley a little over a year earlier. He came with a wagon, a mule, and a leather satchel worn soft from years of use. Inside were surveying tools, notebooks, and carefully folded maps. He wasn't a farmer by trade. He wasn't a rancher. He was a railroad surveyor from Pennsylvania, one of many men sent west to measure routes that promised progress and prosperity. When the railroad company collapsed, Edmund was left with unpaid wages and no reason to go back east. So he stayed. He filed a homestead claim, built a cabin like everyone else, and settled into valley life quietly. He spoke little. He listened a lot. He noticed how the wind moved. How it curled around corners, slammed into walls, and stole warmth no matter how thick the logs were. He noticed how cabins never truly felt warm, only less cold. How men accepted discomfort as a law of nature instead of a problem to solve. On the railroad, Edmund had learned that forces could be measured, predicted, and managed. Wind wasn't magic. Cold wasn't an enemy with a mind of its own. They followed rules, and rules could be used. When Edmund rode to the trading post at Elk Mountain Station in late September and bought 68 yards of heavy canvas tent cloth, the trader nearly laughed. That kind of canvas was used for wagon covers and military tents. It was tough, oiled with linseed to shed water, and expensive. Nearly $40 worth. What are you building? The trader asked. I'm wrapping my cabin, Edmund replied. The trader blinked. You mean patching? No, Edmund said. Wrapping. The news traveled faster than Edmund did on the ride home. By the time he unloaded the canvas at his homestead, people already knew. By the end of the week, Several neighbors had ridden out to see the madness firsthand. What they saw looked absurd. The cabin itself was ordinary enough. 16 by 20 feet. Lodgepole pine logs. Stone hearth. A shake roof. But along the walls, Edmund had nailed thin wooden battens, running horizontally every few feet. They held the canvas away from the logs, leaving a narrow, deliberate gap of air. 0.4 inches. No one understood why. "You planning to live in a tent?" one man asked, grinning. Edmund didn't look up. He was threading rope through metal grommets along the canvas edge, planning to stay warm. He said, "Logs stay warm," the men replied. "That's what logs do." "Only if the wind lets them," Edmund answered. The laughter grew louder as the canvas went up. Women talked about it while quilting. Men joked about it while hauling timber. Children sang foolish rhymes about Carver's tent house. Experienced builders warned him the logs would rot. Former soldiers said the canvas would tear itself apart. Old trappers said winter couldn't be tricked. Edmund said nothing. He worked carefully, overlapping each vertical strip of canvas so snow and rain would slide downward. He sealed the bottom by burying the edge in clay-packed trenches. He brought the fabric over the eaves and lashed it tight to the roof beams. He checked every rope twice. To his neighbors, it looked like a waste of money. To Edmund, it was an experiment he was certain would work. He had calculated it in the margins of his notebooks. Heat loss through conduction. Heat loss through convection. The difference between a moving fluid and a still one. Air, when trapped and motionless, was one of the best insulators known. Logs alone couldn't stop wind-driven heat loss. A dead air space could be why the time October turned cold in earnest, the cabin stood fully wrapped. The mockery peaked, then faded. People lost interest. They assumed Edmund would learn his lesson soon enough. They didn't know how close the test already was. On November 11th, the storm arrived like a hammer. There was no gentle build-up. No soft snowfall. The wind slammed into the valley just before midnight, roaring down from the mountains with a force that shook walls and rattled doors. Snow followed, driven sideways so hard it stung like gravel. Temperatures plunged. 0 came and went. Then came the negatives. Inside most cabins, fires roared. Wood disappeared into flames faster than men could split it. Frost crept across interior walls. Water froze inside buckets sitting only a few feet from stoves. Families huddled together, wrapped in woolen hides, waiting for the wind to ease. It didn't. For more than 2 days, the storm held the valley hostage. Edmund sat inside his cabin with a steady, moderate fire. The canvas boomed and flexed under the wind, but the battens distributed the force. The ropes held. The fabric stayed intact. The air between canvas and logs stayed still. Inside, the temperature barely wavered. Heat radiated from the hearth and stayed where it was meant to stay. No drafts pulled warmth away. No cold currents stripped the walls. Edmund read by lamplight. He cooked. He slept comfortably. Outside, men fed fires every 45 minutes. They fought exhaustion and fear. One lost part of a roof. Another nearly lost a door. A third nearly lost toes to frostbite when his fire failed in the night. When the storm finally broke, silence fell so suddenly it felt unreal. Snow lay deep and heavy across the valley. Drifts swallowed fences. Paths disappeared. The sun rose pale and cold over a landscape reshaped by wind and ice, and then someone noticed the smoke. It rose thin and lazy from Edmund Carver's chimney. That was when disbelief replaced mockery. Neighbors trudged through the snow to see it for themselves. They found the canvas intact. They found the ropes tight. They found a man warm, rested, and calm. They felt the heat spill out when he opened the door. Questions followed. Careful ones. Quiet ones. How much wood did you burn? How warm did it stay? How long did it take to put up? Edmund answered honestly. The numbers stunned them. By winter's end, the valley had changed. Cabins were wrapped. Methods refined. Skeptics turned into students. What began as laughter ended as imitation. Edmund Carver never claimed credit. He never boasted. He simply proved a truth that winter itself confirmed. They thought he was crazy for using a tent, then winter proved him right, and long after the laughter faded, the lesson remained: the world doesn't care how long you've done something the same way. It only cares what works. Spring did not arrive all at once in the Medicine Bow Valley. It came in pauses. A warm afternoon followed by a hard freeze. Snow melting from one slope while another stayed locked in white. But something else had changed beneath the surface of that familiar rhythm. For the first time anyone could remember, winter loosened its grip without leaving the settlement exhausted. Men counted their remaining firewood and realized they had more than usual. Women noticed that walls no longer reeked of smoke and damp wool. Children, who had spent past winters coughing through nights thick with soot and cold air, ran outside sooner and stayed healthier longer. No one said it out loud at first, but everyone understood the same truth: this winter had taken less from them, and it had taken less because of Edmund Carver. As the snow receded, people began removing sections of canvas to inspect what they feared all winter would be waiting underneath. Rot. Mold. Dampness. Something to prove the old warnings right at last. But log after log emerged dry and sound. The wood looked better protected than cabins that had been exposed directly to wind and ice for years. James Dalton returned with a pry bar and a skeptical eye, fully expecting to find hidden damage. He found none. The air gap had allowed moisture to escape instead of trapping it. The logs had aged less in one winter than many did in a single season of exposure. Dalton didn't say much. He didn't need to. He simply put his hand flat against the wood and left it there for a long moment, as if feeling for a truth he had missed his entire career. By late April, the talk shifted from survival to planning. People asked Edmund what could be improved. Could the gap be wider? Could a second layer help? Would oiling the canvas again extend its life? Could the same idea be used for barns, smokehouses, even privies to keep pipes from freezing? Edmund answered carefully. He never claimed certainty beyond what he had measured. He warned against sealing too tightly. He stressed airflow where it mattered and stillness where it counted. He reminded them that the canvas was not magic. It was simply a tool that obeyed rules. That humility made people listen more, not less. When autumn returned the following year, the valley looked different. Not dramatically at first glance, but unmistakably to anyone who knew where to look. Canvas-wrapped cabins stood at nearly every homestead now, some neat and uniform, others improvised with mismatched cloth and rough battens. Even partial wraps appeared on windward walls. No one laughed anymore. They worked together this time. Neighbors helped neighbors. Men who had once mocked Edmund now taught others how to space battens correctly. Women traded tips on oiling and repairing fabric. Children fetched nails and rope instead of firewood. That second winter tested them again. The cold came early, but it did not come as an enemy this time. Fires burned smaller. Nights passed quieter. Storms still howled, but they felt distant, blunted, less personal. The valley did not merely survive. It endured comfortably. Word spread beyond the valley. Travelers stopped to ask why so many cabins looked like freight wagons at rest. Surveyors carried the idea north. Trappers mentioned it at distant posts. A mining camp adopted the system out of desperation and recorded the results when fuel consumption dropped sharply. What began as a single experiment quietly became practice. Edmund watched it all with mild interest. He never claimed ownership of the idea. He never tried to profit from it. When asked why, he shrugged and said warmth should not be a luxury reserved for those who suffered longest. Years later, when rail work returned and Edmund left the valley, his old cabin remained wrapped. The family who bought it replaced the canvas when it wore thin, then replaced it again years later. They never questioned whether it was worth doing. Winter had already answered that question long after Edmund Carver's name faded from conversation. The habit remained. Men forgot who started it. They forgot the arguments and the laughter. But they remembered what worked. They remembered that the cold could be managed, that comfort did not require suffering, and that tradition was not the same thing as truth. And somewhere in the Medicine Bow Valley, canvas still went up before winter, holding still air in place, quietly doing the work no one argued with anymore. November 1892, Medicine Bow Valley, Wyoming. Time has a way of softening sharp memories, but it also has a way of hardening lessons. 5 winters had passed since the storm that changed the valley, and by now the canvas-wrapped cabins no longer drew attention. They had become part of the landscape, as ordinary as split rail fences and smoke rising at dawn. New settlers arriving from the east sometimes asked about them, puzzled by the fabric walls stretched tight over logs. Old-timers answered without ceremony. Keeps the wind out. Keeps the heat in. That was usually enough, but beneath that simple explanation lived a deeper change, one that had quietly reshaped how people thought about survival, labor, and winter itself. The valley no longer entered cold season with the same dread. Before Edmund Carver's experiment, winter had been something endured with clenched teeth and stooped shoulders. It was measured in cords of wood burned, nights slept in layers, and fingers numbed while feeding fires in the dark. Pain was accepted as proof of toughness. Comfort was viewed with suspicion. Now, winter was planned for instead of feared. Woodpiles were smaller but better organized. Cabins smelled less of smoke and more of clean pine. Men had time for repairs, reading, even rest during the darkest months. Women noticed fewer illnesses. Children grew through winters instead of merely surviving them. No one held a meeting to acknowledge the change. It simply became obvious. The most telling sign came during the winter of 1892, when a storm rivaling the one that had proven Edmund right 5 years earlier tore down from the mountains. Winds screamed for 2 days straight. Snow buried trails and snapped fence posts. Temperatures plunged far below 0. And the valley held, canvas flexed. Battens creaked. Fires burned steadily instead of wildly. No one lost a roof. No one lost fingers or toes. When the storm passed, the settlement emerged tired, yes, but intact. That was when the county inspector arrived. He was a young man from Cheyenne, sent to assess winter conditions, infrastructure, and homesteader viability. He had expected hardship reports, supply shortages, complaints. Instead, he found a settlement functioning better than any he'd visited that season. He took notes. He sketched cabins. He asked questions. When he learned that the method had begun with one man's idea, laughed at by his neighbors, he shook his head slowly and said something that stuck with those who heard it. "This is how real progress happens," he said. Not from orders. From observation. The report he filed never mentioned Edmund Carver by name. Bureaucracy rarely preserved individuals. But the technique did not disappear into silence either. It found its way into recommendations. Then into practices. Then, slowly, into expectation. By the late 1890s, variations of the canvas envelope appeared across the territory. Some used oilcloth. Some used layered burlap. Some added sawdust-filled panels. Others widened the air gap. None of it mattered as much as the principle behind it. Still, air mattered. The lesson extended beyond cabins. Barns were wrapped to protect livestock. Smokehouses held heat better. Even root cellars benefited from wind barriers that stabilized temperature. People began to think in terms of flow instead of force, control instead of endurance, and somewhere along the way, the valley's relationship with winter changed permanently. Edmund Carver himself never returned to see how far his idea traveled. After the railroad resumed expansion, he took surveying work farther north. He wrote occasionally to James Dalton, exchanging notes on building methods and materials. His letters were practical, sparse, and curious in tone. He never expressed pride. He asked questions instead. He wondered what might be improved. Dalton saved those letters. Years later, Dalton would say that Edmund's greatest contribution was not the canvas, but the habit of asking why something worked instead of accepting that it simply did. That habit spread quietly. Young men who grew up in the valley learned to build cabins differently from their fathers. They still respected tradition, but they no longer worshipped it. They tested. They measured. They adjusted. When lumber mills eventually reached the region and milled boards replaced raw logs, the principle remained. Walls became layered. Wind was blocked before it reached warmth. Dead air was preserved intentionally. No one called it innovation anymore. It was just how things were done. In 1906, a traveling engineer stopped in the valley during a winter inspection tour. He had studied thermal loss in industrial buildings and was startled by what he observed in these remote cabins. He asked detailed questions and made careful drawings. Before leaving, he remarked that the structures reminded him of double-hulled ships designed for cold seas. The comparison made people smile. They didn't know much about ships, but they knew storms. By the time the Medicine Bow Valley appeared on official maps as a stable settlement rather than a frontier outpost, the hardships that once defined it had softened. Not vanished, but tempered. The people there still worked hard. Winters were still dangerous. But the edge had been taken off. That edge had once been considered necessary. Looking back, the elders sometimes spoke of the winter before Edmund's idea, the one where men nearly burned themselves out just to stay alive. They spoke of exhaustion and fear as if describing another lifetime. Then they would glance at a canvas-wrapped wall and shake their heads slowly. All that suffering, someone would say, and the answer was air. By 1911, forest rangers adopted similar methods for remote stations. By 1920, building papers and early insulation mimicked what canvas and battens had done decades earlier. By the time modern materials arrived, the logic was already old news to anyone who had lived through those winters. The lesson endured because it was proven under pressure, not in a classroom, not in a laboratory, but in a storm that did not care about opinions. Edmund Carver's cabin did not survive because he was stubborn. It survived because he was observant. Because he respected nature enough to study it instead of challenging it blindly. Because he understood that strength did not come from resisting cold with brute force, but from refusing to give it an easy path inside. They thought he was crazy for using a tent. History never remembered the laughter. It remembered the warmth. In the years that followed, the story settled into the valley like a second snowfall, quiet, persistent, shaping everything beneath it. New families grew up never knowing the old kind of winter fear. They heard stories of frostbitten hands and sleepless nights the way one hears legends, half-believed and distant. To them, warmth inside a cabin was not a victory, it was normal. That, more than anything else, marked how deeply the change had taken root. Every autumn, the sound of canvas being stretched became as familiar as the crack of splitting wood. People no longer debated whether to wrap their homes. They debated how best to do it. Some swore by heavier cloth, Others by lighter layers replaced more often. Arguments were friendly now, grounded in shared experience instead of pride. Winter had become a problem to solve together, not an enemy to boast about surviving alone. Visitors sometimes mistook the canvas for poverty or temporary living. Locals rarely corrected them right away. They waited until the first hard wind, the first night of bitter cold, and then invited the visitor inside. Warmth did the explaining better than words ever could. Conversations ended with nods, thoughtful silences, and questions about measurements and spacing. What endured most strongly was not the material, but the mindset it created. When other challenges came, floods, droughts, failed crops, the people of the valley approached them differently. They looked for quiet advantages, small changes that altered outcomes. They listened more carefully to those who observed instead of those who shouted. Somewhere along the line, Edmund Carver became less a man and more a symbol, though few could have explained it that way. He represented the moment when laughter gave way to learning, when certainty cracked just enough to let understanding in. His name appeared occasionally in letters or old records, but his real legacy lived in habits passed down without ceremony, and each winter, when the wind pressed hard against canvas walls and slipped away defeated, the valley remembered, without speaking it aloud, that being right is not always loud, and wisdom does not always arrive wearing authority. Sometimes it comes wrapped in cloth, standing quietly while the storm proves its point. As decades passed, the canvas itself slowly changed. Oil-soaked cloth gave way to treated fabric, then to layered boards and early insulating materials. Yet the old cabins that remained wrapped in canvas were never mocked or dismissed as outdated. They were respected, even admired, because they represented the moment when survival stopped being a contest of suffering and became a matter of understanding. Elders would sometimes run their hands along the fabric, feeling the way it moved slightly with the wind, and remember how once that movement had been mistaken for weakness. Children growing up in the valley learned this lesson without being taught directly. They watched how their parents prepared for winter calmly, without panic. They saw how small design choices mattered, how a crack in a wall could steal warmth, how a layer of still air could protect it. These ideas followed them into adulthood, shaping how they built, how they planned, and how they solved problems far beyond housing. When newspapers from larger towns occasionally wrote about frontier ingenuity, the valley rarely made the headlines. Its changes were too quiet, too practical, lacking drama. But travelers carried the story onward in pieces, telling of a place where winters were no longer brutal teachers but firm, predictable ones. Other settlements borrowed what they could, adapting it to their own landscapes and climates, often without knowing where the idea began. What endured above all was humility. The valley had learned, through one man's willingness to be ridiculed, that certainty could be dangerous and curiosity could be life-saving. When storms came, people trusted preparation more than pride. When someone proposed an idea that sounded strange, they listened longer before laughing, and every year, as canvas was tightened and the first snow fell, the lesson was renewed, not as a story told around the fire, but as warmth felt in the bones. Winter still came, relentless and indifferent, but it no longer ruled the valley. It was simply another season, met with quiet confidence and walls that breathed just enough to keep life safe inside.